Century 14 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Ride-On Optics. Ride-On is bringing you high-quality glass at a great value. I use and trust their scopes, binoculars, and red dot sights, and you can too with their unconditional lifetime warranty. If you ever have a problem with their gear, they will replace it, not repair it. Finish up your next build and keep a little extra cash on hand for ammo so you can actually go out and shoot that thing. Find your next optic at rideonoptics.com. Also by Dryfire Mag. Dryfire Mag solves the common and annoying problem of having to rack the slide every time you press the trigger in dry fire training. One of the bad habits that took me a long time to break was proper trigger follow through in dry fire. The dry fire mag will help you eliminate that problem almost immediately. Go buy a dry fire mag and double your training reps in just a few minutes a day at dryfiremag.com. So this is going to be a solo episode to talk about training safety. Now, I don't, bottom line up front, I don't have this all figured out, right? Every time I plan training, I have to try to make it better, make the training effective, make it engaging and quote unquote fun and all that stuff. And I also have to make sure that I'm doing it safely. And I've had close calls. I've had things come up that I didn't think about, and that still happens. In fact, I'll give you some examples of that where just recently some of these things came up. So it's not the sort of thing that I'm here to tell you about as some expert, like I have this all squared away. In fact, one of the benefits I get from doing an episode like this is it forces me to sit down and think and write about some of this, and that helps me learn and grow as well. The other thing is I've also gotten to attend and be a part of a lot of amazing training over the years, and when I reflect back and I try to boil down some of the lessons learned, there are common threads in there that I think will help anyone listening to this who might be involved in planning or conducting training, and so hopefully I can bring those things to you in a useful way. Because most of the time that training is good, or it's training that is worthwhile, there's usually some complexity and some realism there that bring with it an element of risk, especially in settings where our actual operational environment, public safety, the military, whatever, is dangerous. And that takes a little bit of maturity and the right amount of oversight, because there are trade-offs and decisions that have to be made with that. I can only make training so real. We've talked about that. I can't just take you down range and start shooting at you to see how you're going to do, right? That's not ethical. That's not okay. And although that might sound kind of extreme, there are points where I really do need to take, we got to go out on the range with our teammates and shoot around each other in a three-dimensional world outside of just that 180 flat, everyone online range. And so I really do have to do that sometimes. So I've got to do that in a way that demands that they will be functionally aware of where their buddies are. And I can only do so much to emphasize those rules and those realities using simunitions and marking cartridges and blanks and that sort of thing. So there have to be ways that I can get incrementally safer at practicing some of those things in real life that isn't just dumb. And so we're trying to strike that balance there. So like I mentioned, the way that we do that from an academic standpoint is with the ORM, or Operational Risk Management Model. And I know it sounds real procedural and it sounds like something out of a textbook, but when you actually understand it, it kind of makes a lot of sense. So for the sake of your own education, I guess, in case you don't remember or you're not familiar with it, we'll run through that. And more crucially, what you need to accept and understand about making training awesome and also safe is that the devil is in the details. So sure, we can ask ourselves about safety. We can say things like, okay, we're going to this training area, there's no live guns over there, and obvious things like we're going to do a safety checkpoint. And there are some details in there that really make or break the effectiveness of those practices. For example, one of the biggest risks might not actually be to whether or not people know to bring guns and ammo in there. It might actually be the effectiveness or the accuracy of your safety checkpoints, because we get so used to doing safety checks that it's easy to get complacent, and it's normal to not find anything. So it's not as recognizable sometimes to notice when people have violated some safety rule and brought something in that they shouldn't have until they've already gotten through it. And you have to account for that, those human elements, those human factors when you make your plan. So there's some gotchas that you have to account for, and you have to figure out how to build redundancy and certainty into your plan. And if you're going to accept certain risks, that you're doing so because it was a conscious decision and that your leadership or your bosses or whoever understand those risks. And at the end of the day, that your students understand or at least consent to taking those risks as well. Because, a lot of times what we forget as instructors is, our leadership might be okay with it on some level. As instructors, we might be okay with it on some level, but we also have to make sure that our students ultimately, they're the ones that are going to pay the price in many cases if we screw this up. And so they have to understand and consent to that as well, and kind of understand where you're coming from on that. And it's important for you to internalize that, because your safety they're putting in your hands. So I think those things are all important. So ORM, operational risk management, in a nutshell, is a process that helps us dive into those details a little bit. And this is key because when we're trying to avoid bad outcomes or bad results, it's critical that we focus on the process and not rely on luck to save our ass. So when you plan training and you have a bad outcome, people are going to reverse engineer that and figure out, well, how did this happen, right? And a lot of times when we only focus on those bad outcomes, the times that we don't have anything bad happen, the good outcomes, those are the result of, well, you're just lucky that nothing ever went wrong. And, luck is not a tactic and all that. So you need to take a segment of your time and a segment of your actual plan to think about and address these safety issues as part of the process. And if you don't, there's been things I've brushed over in the past and gotten lucky. There is going to be a time that something happens and you're going to be like, oh my God, that could have been really bad, or worse, right? It does go really bad. So even if you do all this stuff, even if you have taken the time, you can still have a bad outcome because no plan is perfect. But this whole process is hopefully going to, if nothing else, reduce the severity of it, avoid or, prevent it from being catastrophic, if not preventing it altogether. So the basic steps of the process are identify and assess the risks, make risk decisions, implement risk control measures, monitor and review. So again, I know that's all super academic. We'll break down at each one of those. I'll give you some examples. I'll try to keep this as entertaining for you as I can, but I want to also incorporate some, little pearls in there on making training good that I think play into the safety thing. Because my goal in creating this episode was to use training safety as sort of a head fake to help people design training to be good. And if I were smart, I probably would have done it the other way around, right? I would have said, let's make training awesome, and then really made it about safety. But again, if I'm being honest, it's both, right? They're so intertwined. When you make training good, it's going to be realistic. And when you make it realistic, there are going to be hazards. And so it's all, connected in that sense. So number one, identify and assess the risks. In anything that we do in the sort of work that we're involved with, I assume if you're listening to this, it's someone who is involved with some kind of operational training or planning. The risks are plentiful, and some of them are really obvious and some of them are more nuanced, right? And so it would be easy to say things like, okay, we're going to talk about safety because we're doing, something involving helicopters. Okay, well that's, yeah, there's all kinds of safety stuff to know about working with helicopters because, they tend to crash and stuff. If you're doing things at night and you're using night vision, right? It's easy to miss stuff. Visibility is impaired. Anything related to using live fire, even if it's not live fire, it could be simunitions or force on force training. But where I'm going with this is those are all the types of things that, when you start thinking about, you can really kind of get tunnel vision on the safety hazards of those things. Oh, we're gonna go shoot on the range. Well, let's not shoot anybody. All right, well, that's pretty obvious. What are we going to do about approaching helicopters and making sure people all come from the right direction and don't get, their head chopped off or whatever? Simunitions, like let's not poke an eye out with one of those things. If you're doing force on force training that involves fighting, then, where do we draw the line in realism? When people start picking up bricks and stones and stuff, I mean, we have to, those things are pretty clear. But in either of those cases, there's going to be some degree of acceptable risk. And that's a term that I think is important because there's always going to be risk. And a lot of administrators don't like that, right? They have to simply, they want to they're risk averse. They want to avoid it altogether. There's liability there. They see dollar signs. They see their careers being affected. And so that gets in the way of things really, really quick. And so you need to frame everything around degree of acceptable risk, right? These are the things that we know are potentially going to happen, and this is what we're going to do about them. And as you chip away at the likelihood and the severity of risk, you'll find that people get a little bit more, it warms them up to the idea of whatever you're trying to do. So first, let's take a minute and just talk about some of the characteristics of good training. One of the first things, I think, is that it has to be challenging. One of the mistakes that I've seen a lot of trainers do, and this goes in one of two directions. The first is they go overboard, and rather than just trying to challenge their students, they essentially overwhelm them. And it's, they're strobe lights and sirens, and, they're getting sprayed with water hoses, and it's just over the top, right? And while I can appreciate that in some instances, there's an element of, sensory overload, that can be useful to an extent, right? And in some limited cases. But it's important to remember what we're trying to accomplish, right? And that actually brings up a good first step in this, which is defining your objectives. Reality is hard, right? And so if we're going to make training realistic, it has to be difficult just like real life. And so it's one thing to want to say oh, you think this is hard? Wait till those are real bullets. Yeah, that's true. But if you're trying to help people grow, you have to, identify those little stepping stones that help them get closer to the challenges they're going to face in real life. And I want to reiterate that because I think it's important. It shouldn't be as difficult as real life can be in some cases. It should get them incrementally closer to the next level of difficulty that they can handle. Now, there's a caveat in there because the second direction that I've seen people go with this is they overemphasize, we're going to go back to the basics. Or they talk about the common, phrase I hear is, crawl, walk, run. We gotta crawl before we can walk and something like that, right? That's fine. The fundamentals are important. To be super, super, super clear, the fundamentals are critically important. But the crawl, walk, run approach only works if you run at some point. And there is something to be said about making training difficult so that real life seems easy. So the key in this dichotomy, this balancing act of difficulty and making things challenging but also doable and passable, right, is knowing your audience and then playing to all sides. On one hand, you need to concentrate on the fundamentals and you need to build that basic skill proficiency to a degree of automaticity. In policing, for example, you want shooting, driving, and fighting to be things that can occur without a lot of, conscious thought. Those should be able to be tasks that we know so well that we can perform them more or less in the background, and we can save those valuable brain bites for the cognitive load to deal with things like communication and critical thinking and planning. On the other hand, you also need to teach your students to perform outside of their comfort zone and to be mentally engaged in their tasks so that they can build that catalog, right? That index of solutions, if you will, for different types of problems. And so there's different ways to accomplish that. They all involve repetition and coaching, but they should also be challenging. But when you're trying to make training challenging, you're not just making it hard, just arbitrarily making it a pain in the ass, right? You need to be thoughtful about that. Because the other thing that you can do is make it so hard that people are just they tune you out or they don't want to come to your training because they're like, all right, I already know what this is going to be. It's going to be stupid and it's going to, it's going to suck and it's going to waste my time, and that's not good for anybody, right? So it's a dichotomy. Make sure that you try to find that balance, and you're constantly going to have to refine that. So turning this back into safety, as you can see, there's a lot that we have to think about when it comes to training design. And again, these are intertwined, because making it challenging and realistic and building on the fundamentals and task proficiency, this list goes on, right? With anything that complex, there are going to be things that we miss. And there are going to be risks associated with making training dynamic and challenging. So it's important to take that separate chunk of time, like I said earlier, to do some safety planning. And there's a lot of ways that you can approach this. Some people will designate like one guy as like the safety person. Like, you're going to be the safety officer. You're in charge of safety. Go, right? And then the other way people will approach this is they'll say something like, well, everyone's a safety officer. Oh, okay. Yeah, I think both are good practices, right? Again, the devil's in the details, so the key is in the execution. Yes, I think one person should take separate time to figure out what hazards exist and how to mitigate them. And that can be you, or it can be whoever's designing the training, or you can outsource that to a responsible adult. But you need to make sure that that person understands exactly what the training is going to look like. And that person has to have the authority to make decisions that maybe the person designing the training, and that might be you, isn't going to like. So this is like one of those things, just saying like, well, I had a designated safety officer, so it's his problem, right? Nope, it's not a get out of jail free card. Assigning it to someone who doesn't have a good grasp of what they are doing, or what you are doing, or what the training is actually going to look like, that's not a successful strategy. It's just food for thought, because those are the sorts of things that just get glossed over because someone says, well, so-and-so is going to be my safety officer, and so they can kind of move on to the next thing. No, that person needs to be involved and engaged in the whole process, right? So identify and assess the risk. There's going to be a lot of things to look for, and this is like that forest and trees analogy that we're talking about often. I mentioned this earlier. Some of these risks are super obvious, like if you're doing live fire, don't shoot anybody. It seems obvious, but when you decide that your training objective involves something like, we're going to shoot in low light conditions at night, or shoot on the move, or shoot in a 360-degree shoot house, or in multiple directions around other people, and they're going to be maneuvering, okay, now things get a lot more difficult, right? And so we'll talk about how to navigate some of those things in a bit, but those are the big picture items that you might need to take a lot of your time planning around. If you're doing force on force stuff, you need to think about the sort of injuries you're going to deal with there, whether that involves shooting each other with simunitions or fighting with people, or both, right? Like, I've seen a lot of times where we plan a simunitions scenario and we're thinking like, okay, this is like a shoot, no shoot thing. And then you don't anticipate that the person going through the scenario decides it's no shoot, but I'm going to go clobber that guy in the face. And then someone gets hurt from that, right? So recognizing the blend or the other possible outcomes is important. A couple common hazards that people will almost always spout off with in any safety plan, they'll talk about things like trip hazards. They'll say environmental stuff like extreme heat, extreme cold. They'll talk about critters, snakes, spiders, bears. In Southern Arizona, we have things like actual human and drug traffickers. If you're doing anything out in the mountains or the desert, you might actually come across that sort of thing. Some of the less common things that often get overlooked, we've done a lot of training in places, buildings specifically, that were going to be demolished, old buildings that were kind of just occupying space and they got bought out and they're going to do new construction there or whatever. And the people that own that land, or if the city buys it before they demolish it, they'll let us go in there and they'll let us practice all kinds of stuff, shotgun breaching, shooting doors open with shotguns, or explosive breaching, or we'll do, force on force training or something where it's a new floor plan somewhere we haven't been before, and we'll have to do a hostage rescue in there or something, and we'll get to shoot the place up with simunitions and marking cartridges and all that. We might do window breaching. We might, whatever, like all kinds of stuff that we could go in there and just basically trash the place. And all of those individual things have their own clear and serious safety risks just by themselves, right? Like explosive breaching. Well, that's hazardous, or it can be anyway. Shotgun breaching, that can be sketchy, right? We're breaking windows. There's going to be glass and stuff. So all those things have their own risks. But in a lot of those old buildings, the construction also had stuff like asbestos and lead paint. And so those are the gotchas, right? The stuff that if you didn't plan ahead for, we'd have people go into these buildings and start blowing shit up. And now we've got all this particulate in the air that was no good for us whatsoever. And that was something that on a couple occasions we've had to learn the hard way. So you have to kind of figure those things out and ask specifically about that stuff as you're going into it, because again, it's easy to get kind of tunnel vision on the big things and you forget about those little details. So that's identify and assess the risks. The next big category in making training awesome but also safe is making risk decisions. So this is where once you've identified all or at least most of the things that can go wrong, you start deciding that degree of acceptable risk part. What risks are we willing to accept? And what things are you going to skip out on or take baby steps towards if you want to use that crawl, walk, run approach? This is the sort of thing that, one, you need to be the mature and responsible adult about, and two, you should probably run up your chain at some point. Run up the chain of command, run by your leadership, or at least run it by another sober adult to make sure that you're not missing something. At the core of these decisions, we are balancing the probability of something happening and the severity of it happening, and what ways we can mitigate or avoid that risk. And I have a pretty good example of this. This is actually just from the last couple of weeks. I was planning a drill. It involved some shooting and running and moving towards casualties at night. And there were some aspects of the drill that we made some decisions about. For one thing, as an example of something I had not anticipated was, I did all this prep work for this drill, right? And in the days leading up, we had a whole bunch of rain. And so the range was like sopping wet with mud. And I did not expect that night when we did this drill that it was still going to be wet and muddy. And we were going to have guys running through the mud with loaded rifles. So we had to make the decision. How do we deal with that risk? Or is there something we want to change about the drill to avoid that risk altogether? And the risk specifically that we're dealing with there is someone slips and falls and they have an unintentional discharge with a loaded rifle, right? In our case, we decided, okay, this is part of that degree of acceptable risk. We're going to brief it. We're going to remind these guys that they're going to be potentially running through spots of mud and they need to maintain positive control of their rifle. So throttle their speed so that if they do slip and fall, they can keep control of their gun and keep it pointed in a safe direction. But for the integrity of the skills that we were working on and for what we were trying to accomplish, we decided to go ahead and include the running and the loaded rifles. We still wanted guys to run, just maybe not in a dead sprint. And we still wanted the rifles to be loaded. We weren't going to take that step and implement it further down range. So that was a deliberate choice that we made in the context of people performing this particular drill. And when someone pointed out to me that the range was all muddy, it was something I thought about. I approached another sober adult, one of our guys that is frequently involved with safety decisions on the team. And I said, what do you think about this? This is what I'm thinking. And he agreed with me. And so we went with it. So along those same lines, for part of this drill, and this was a decision that we made prior to, this was part of the design of the drill in the first place. We had people paired up, and one guy was going to be the shooter, and one was going to be moving up to a casualty and packaging them up on a litter and then moving them. And that was going to involve basically throwing their rifle over their shoulder on a sling. And so in the prep work for this, before we actually got to that day, one of the decisions that I made as part of this drill was that person was going to be doing everything with an empty gun. So they would get a chance to switch. One person was going to be the shooter. One was going to do the packaging and the moving. The guy doing the packaging and the moving was going to clear out their rifle, have a safety officer double check it, and the only one with a loaded rifle was going to be the one that was going to be shooting in the context of this particular drill. So that was a decision that we made. It was just one of those things where, I don't like the idea of being on a range and having someone throw their rifle over a shoulder. It points in weird directions it's not accountable for. The safety can get caught on gear. The trigger can get pulled, blah, blah, blah. In real life, that might be a risk that you have to take in the context of this drill. We weren't losing anything by having them do that with a gun that was cleared and then had been double checked by a safety officer. So that was, again, just another example of a risk decision. In either of those cases, you need to remember that these are decisions that have consequences, and you should always at least seek a second opinion, because you don't want to allow yourself to just talk yourself into whatever it is you want to do. Run it by someone, bring them a solution or an explanation, explain some of your rationale. These are the pros, these are the cons, cost benefit sort of thing. And if nothing else, see if there's anything that you're missing or maybe another idea that you haven't thought of to work around it. So let's say more generally that it's something like that. We're talking about making risk decisions, and this is some kind of dynamic shoot and move drill at night in a shoot house. This might be the place where you say, okay, the risks of someone getting shot, I think this drill is worthwhile, but in this situation or with this audience, maybe we should just use simunitions or marking cartridges instead of doing this live fire. That's one way you can mitigate the risk, right? Or if you're going to take things to live fire, you say, maybe we start this during the day, and we're not going to run this the first time at night. Maybe we keep the lights on and we focus on low light stuff in another drill. And there might come a point where, we need to combine those things. We've done enough training wheels exercises here to get us incrementally closer to real life on this. And now it's time that we need to do it all together, right? So when you're thoughtful about it and you say, like, what are the ways that I can accomplish these training objectives in a safe way and get us closer to that real world outcome? That's where you start making some of these decisions. And obviously, I'm not here to do that math for you. I can't tell you what your organization or your team or your people are ready for or capable of, or what risk you should accept or not accept. Obviously, this is not legal advice and blah, blah, blah. Those are things that you've got to figure out. But what I can say is, again, going back to that stepping stones thing, you've got to be thinking about ways to get incrementally closer to that big training scenario or that big test by isolating those individual components, individual skills or tasks, and clearly defining your training objectives so that you can prepare people for what's going to be expected of them. You certainly don't want the first time that they've done any of this stuff to be when they get tested in real life, right? So sit down, have those conversations, decide what you're ready for, but have a plan. If you're going to, again, crawl, walk, run, right? Make sure that you're building on stuff. I think a huge part of making these risk decisions as an organization or a team or whatever is if you can kind of testify or demonstrate or illustrate why people have been able to get closer to those big things. Like, okay, well, this is our shooting proficiency as described by our, whatever our standards or our qualifications are. We've done this task in these conditions in daylight. We've done this task in these conditions at nighttime, or maybe it's not nighttime, but low ambient light conditions. And we've done this with white light. We've done this with night vision. We've done, and wherever that takes you, you can make that argument and say, okay, so therefore I think we're ready for X. And along the way, you might say, okay, well, why don't we try this like this first? And then we'll approach the other way later. This is just kind of the thought process that goes into it. So 2 cautions that I have, other than just, involving your leadership, running it by a sober adult, and making sure that you're being thoughtful about all of this, are the phrases big boy rules and lowest common denominator. We've probably talked about this a number of times on the show. These 2 expressions are things that I get heard tossed around at either end of the spectrum in terms of, we are dumbing this down so that even a cop or a soldier or a fireman or whatever can't screw it up. Or, you guys are professionals, we expect you to be able to do this safely without extra checks for training or oversight. Both of those are equally problematic to me, right? Teaching to the lowest common denominator and reducing the quality of our training for the sake of risk avoidance is often setting up our troops to fail in real life. And it does little or nothing to advance the status quo of our team or our organization, whatever we're trying to accomplish. And talking about big boy rules as if it gives you or anyone else in a position of authority or trust a pass on a mishap when things go sideways is dangerous and unacceptable. Making training awesome and also safe means being the mature adult who carefully analyzes that balance and plans for both the forest and trees aspect of this. Training is supposed to mimic and ultimately prepare people for real life. And getting people injured or killed in the process is not only immoral, obviously, but it's also counterproductive, right? You're not getting people out in the field hacking at the mish or whatever if you get them hurt or killed. So you have to play to both sides of that, and it means being careful and thoughtful. So lowest common denominator, avoid that. Don't reduce or dumb down the quality of your training. And big boy rules. It doesn't give you a pass to say that we're playing by big boy rules and therefore we're going to put safety in that ball in their court, because that's not how this works. That falls on you. So enough said about that. So make those risk decisions. Make risk decisions deliberately, purposefully, and consciously. Once we've made risk decisions, let's also talk about risk control measures. The big question here is, outside of common sense and good judgment and big boy rules or whatever, what are the stupid things that stupid humans are going to do anyway that get us in trouble? And how can we mitigate those risks? What can we do about them? So along the way, we've already talked about some ideas for this. We can isolate certain components of our training in a way that mitigates risks. But at some point, we've decided to accept certain risks, and there's got to be some checks and balances to either reduce or mitigate those risks somehow. And this is more than a safety briefing. I think most people hear safety briefings and it goes in one ear and out the other. But sure, we should have one of those. It should include things like, hey, this is the medical plan. This is where we have a kit staged. This is our designated contact for emergencies. This is the person that's going to make the call. Have a medic on site. Make sure you have that person identified. Have a backup in case they're the one that gets hurt. All those things are good. Have a safety briefing. Absolutely. Where this gets a little bit more fuzzy is when we start talking about situations where human factors are at play. So let's say you're running a shooting range doing firearms training, and people are drawing from concealment or drawing from the holster. And this is something that a lot of civilian ranges in the US don't even allow because of the risks of people drawing and reholstering. If you go slow and you're thoughtful, usually you don't have any problems. But inevitably, people start getting brave, they pick up the speed, they get complacent, right? And that's when they start, putting their finger on the trigger a little too quickly, or they're finding their trigger finds obstructions on the way back into the holster and things like that. That's the battle that we're up against. So I started to talk about this just a little bit in the very beginning. A good example that we've had to wrestle with in my, circles at work is when we do any kind of force on force or training involving simunitions, marking cartridges, where they are technically real guns, but they're shooting a marking cartridge that stings and you can shoot each other with them, and it's, not a big deal. Obviously, when you go into those environments, you want to make sure that all the real guns and all the real bullets and all the real magazines and whatever are put away and not in the training area. And so we set up safety checks. And let's say, for example, that a group of people who typically carry real guns everywhere they go, and they use them professionally, and they're very comfortable with real guns, and they're going into a training environment where we are going to shoot at other humans with marking cartridges. We know, like common sense, right? bringing real guns and ammo into that scenario could be deadly. We know that. So if we have assessed the likelihood and the severity of that possibility to be pretty high, why would we choose to do it anyway on purpose? Well, we wouldn't, right? Why would we move forward with that training? Why, how do we make that safe? Well, because we can put several measures in place, risk control measures, you might call them, to reduce the likelihood of that happening quite a bit. Maybe not zero, but probably pretty close. And how? So we can have a series of safety checkpoints. Now, the hard part about this is that most of the time, the people involved in this sort of training who do it often will remember to put all their guns and ammo and all that away. And if they don't, the safety checkpoint should catch it. But since most people put their stuff away and do a pretty good job of that, most people at the safety checkpoints don't find anything. And since they don't ever find anything, they are at risk for getting that normalcy bias, right? They are at risk for essentially going through the motions complacently without actually looking. Your brain defaults to see things as normal, and we have to get in the habit of identifying things that are abnormal. So having a safety checkpoint is good, and having someone double check and make sure that you don't have anything on you you're not supposed to is good, but only if those people are actually paying attention and actually catch stuff. So there's again some room for a gotcha in there. One way I think that we can make people better at this and less complacent is by intentionally planting inert decoys, but stuff that looks real, right? Guns and ammo, and making sure that we put those send those through our safety checkpoints, which will not only test our safety checks, but you can also tell people outright, like, hey, just so you know, like every time we do safety checks, there's going to be something out there for you to find. And so hopefully they're going to start looking for them because they know they're there, and they're doing it with purpose, right? And it's not, again, this isn't like just to screw with people. We're not just trying to mess with them or anything. We're doing that on purpose. We're telling them that stuff is there, and we are putting stuff there so that they really will look for the real stuff, right? So I think that's a good way of kind of doing that. Another way is redundancy, right? You have a layered approach to safety checks so that the chance of, this is like the Swiss cheese model that Jim talks about in flying, where like, you might slip through the cracks in certain ways, but to slip through all the cracks, it would take a lot of work, right? So you might get through one safety check without finding anything, but if you get through 3, that would be pretty difficult. So a way that we approach this at my work is I always take all my stuff out. I double check myself. I have a buddy check me. I go through a big safety checkpoint when I get my simunition gear. And then the instructor at whatever scenario or whatever training area we're actually going to is also responsible for setting up a final safety check before that evolution actually begins. So those layers build the redundancy and reduce that likelihood as much as possible so that it's really unlikely that I'm going to end up in there with anything that's going to hurt anybody. What other risk control measures can we talk about? So things like trip and fall hazards, those are kind of difficult sometimes. It might be something that if I'm going to an area where there are trip and fall hazards that I can move, like that I just remove those from the area. If it's stuff that I can't move, then maybe I can adjust my training area so that the approach of where people are going to go goes around them. Let's say I'm going to be lifting and moving people, right? Like I do a lot of the medical stuff on our team. And if we're doing casualty evacuation or tactical medicine stuff, lifting and moving people are big risks. Like we hurt people all the time, lifting and moving casualties. Now, those are pretty likely. They're generally not as severe as like a gun gets into the training area and we shoot somebody, but they can still be serious potentially. And one way I can mitigate that risk to some degree is to make sure that guys are doing a warm-up before we start the training, right? We're going to do some warm-up and stretching exercises dynamic stretching, not static stretching. And we can make sure that people are using good body mechanics. So one of your instructors, if you know that a move is about to happen, should be there to spot them and remind them, lift with your legs, like get your butt down, whatever it might be. And that can maybe help prevent some injuries or mitigate some injuries. So those are some examples that you might be able to go into the more, nuanced areas of training that still pose a risk. A lot of risk control measures are going to be equipment based. So when we talk about simunition training, force on force stuff, it's just having the right equipment. A lot of times that equipment costs money, and that's hard to get around in many cases. But that's where you go back to your risk decisions and you say, okay, we don't really have the safety equipment to pull off this force on force simunition training the way that we want. Can we do something using like SIRT pistols? And SIRT pistols are it's like an inert training gun that has a little laser marker on the end of it. So when you pull the trigger, it shoots a laser, and you can at least see where hits would go. And you don't get the full effect of a pain penalty as far as marking cartridges, but you can still, pull actual triggers and stuff like that. So there's other ways that you might be able to work around some of those things as far as cost goes, but that's what we're trying to do. We actually deal with this a lot on a tactical team, because dealing with simunitions, you need to wear those simunitions helmets. And if you've ever seen these, it's like effectively, it's like a paintball mask that goes over your face, but it goes all the way around your head and drapes down in front of your neck. And it's this big like helmet and face shield, so that if you get shot with a marking cartridge, you're not going to have, serious injuries with getting hit in the eye or something like that. Well, the problem is they have a huge impact on our ability to see and communicate. So inter-team dynamics, where I need to be able to talk to my teammates and see what they're doing, it makes it really hard when you put those helmets on. On one hand, if I can do it with the helmet on, then I could certainly do it without, right? On the other hand, there's components of that inter-team dynamic, that skill building, where it is worth a little bit of risk to maybe lose the helmets. So you have to balance that, and that's part of your decision-making process, and say, well, what are some ways I can mitigate that? All right. Well, one thing is those companies make face shields that, mount onto our helmets. They're like, I don't know, hundreds of dollars a piece, and we would need 40 or 50 of them to get the whole team outfitted. So they're very expensive, but it is out there. It exists. You could buy them. On the other hand, maybe I can get really disciplined and really good role players and make sure that they're only shooting like from the waist down. Hey, shoot them in the legs. That's their pain penalty, but I don't want you to shoot them any higher than the waist, because they're not going to be wearing helmets, and that's part of our risk mitigation strategy, right? And does the occasional round fly high? Yeah, that could happen. And so that's a risk that we take sometimes, but these are the sorts of discussions you have to have. So some other risk control measure stuff, and we touched on having a plan B, like what do you do when the mishaps do occur? An important conversation that is related and probably comes before that when it comes to risk decisions and the resulting risk control measures that might come with that are what injuries or mishaps we're going to train past or through, and which ones we're going to stop training for. This, again, depends on the type of training that we're doing. There are going to be things that people can deal with, but it's worth talking about ahead of time, because you want to know how you're going to approach those things when they come up. The reason I bring this up is because, let's say, for example, I'm doing jujitsu, right? There's a resilience component to jujitsu, just on this is like a personal risk management thing. If I'm on the mats and I'm rolling, I expect to feel some pain, right? Like, trust me on this. If you've never done it, it's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to feel some pain. You're going to feel it tomorrow. And sometimes I need to just suck it up and just deal with it, push through it, because that's literally part of the game. But sometimes I, just need to go ahead and tap or whatever, because it's not worth ending my career early on a medical because I blow out a shoulder for my pride. Like that's not helping anything. So that doesn't help me survive my career learning how to fight, but also blowing out my shoulder because I was too proud to tap. So that's a personal example, and you're going to have to figure out organizationally what people are willing to accept, both people going through the training and also what, the administration or the bureaucracy of your organization can accept. One thing that we've seen with police recruits is when we'll do some simunition training, we start shooting marking cartridges at them during a scenario. They might, once they get shot with one of those things, they'll stop as if like training has ended. They'll be like, "Oh, you got me. Oh, I'm dead. He shot me. I'm done." No, that's not how that works, right? Just because you got shot doesn't mean you're done. You're not dead just because you get shot. You could do something about that. And so I need people to work through that. That's not acceptable to just throw your hands up in the air. Does it hurt a little? Yeah, I guess it's not that big of a deal. Can it cause some minor injuries? Sure. You take it to bare skin, it could get a little gross sometimes. But the point of those cartridges, and a big part of the reason that we use them, is to reinforce good and bad tactics and to inoculate people to stress and to being wounded, and ultimately to see how people are going to respond, because you don't get to just throw your hands up in a gunfight. You got to fight through it. So this is part of that discussion and the planning. And there's little things like this that I can think of. Like, you're on the range and you get brass down your shirt. What do you do? Or as a firearms instructor, what do I do if someone gets brass down their shirt? I've got to see that, right? And be ready to react to that, because people will, as they, go to lean back and try to reach for stuff, they'll forget what they're doing with their gun and they'll point it in all kinds of crazy directions. Little boo-boo items that might not be covered by your big trauma plan per se, but you have to look at to maybe prevent bigger problems. When we do SWAT schools, we have guys running around in kit and going all over the academy grounds. And so they're going to have blisters and feet issues. They might twist an ankle. They might get a little dehydrated. They'll have heat-related issue, whatever. And so part of my risk control or risk mitigation strategy, risk control measures, are going to be things like, okay, making sure that they have enough water, take appropriate breaks, and then decide what things they're expected to work through and when I'm going to halt training. And so maybe I put some medics out there and like, hey, your job is to go and keep an eye on these guys. And if you need to pull one aside because they're acting funny, then do it, because they might think that they're just going to tough it out. And we don't need a guy to go, fall and put his face into the pavement and knock out a couple teeth because, he's dehydrated, right? So that's a good risk mitigation or risk control measure. And then having a plan for halting training. Like if you're going to call a ceasefire on the range, are there phrases or commands that you need to incorporate or brief everybody on? If you're going to end a scenario early or at all, how do you do that in a way that everyone knows? And then finally, like big part of the plan B when people do get hurt is having that solid medical plan. Thinking about things like, how can EMS get to me? Where can I land a helicopter? Who's going to make the call? What's the number to dial? How can I evacuate people to close the distance to help? Those sorts of things are all part of your risk control planning. And that takes us basically to this last thing, which is monitor and review. And that is to say that not every plan is going to be perfect. You constantly have to keep your eyes open and you're watching for things that have to be adjusted. Your safety plan might be failing, or there might be risks that you hadn't considered, like mud on the range, for example. And this is where it helps to have a designated person or maybe even a team of people who are focused only on safety. But again, it has to be a layered approach. You have to have enough engagement on this that you don't miss the big obvious things. And if it's just something little, that you missed, okay, we can probably live with that. But the big stuff should be pretty clear. So that is the basic risk management process that we're always talking about. And I know Jim has talked about in episodes before, and this is just kind of my take or my spin on it and how I apply it to some of the training that I'm often involved with doing. It's just a model. It's one way of approaching your planning in a methodical way. Identify the hazards, assess the risk, make risk decisions, implement risk control measures where appropriate, and monitor and review. But just making it safe doesn't make it awesome. So we talked in the beginning about how this wasn't supposed to just be a safety talk only. We also want to make training awesome and realistic, but those two are intertwined. So I want to talk a little bit more about building our training plans to make it awesome. One of the biggest things that we talked about early on as it relates to risk, because it lets us kind of define the scope of our training in terms of what decisions and what risks we're willing to accept, is training objectives. What lessons do you want your students to take away from your training or your scenario? And this requires some deliberate thought, because a lot of times we might ask a guy or a gal to run a scenario and it'll just be a canine scenario, or it'll be a shoot, no shoot scenario, or a building clearing scenario, or whatever. If you're a fire EMS person, it might be a mass casualty drill, or a medical scenario, or a trauma scenario. And those themes, I would call them themes, not objectives, are good to give you a starting point, but they're not enough, right? Like if someone says, hey, hey, Jim, can you put on a scenario for us for building clearing? Or can you put on a trauma drill for us? That's fine. Like that's a theme. It's not an objective though. So you need to isolate the components of those big picture tasks to really determine what your training will accomplish. And this is a huge part of making training effective, right? Being detail oriented is important here. I said in the safety planning part of this, the devil's in the details. It doesn't have to be complicated. It just needs to be specific, and you need to think through it in a thorough way as far as making your scenario or your drill contextually appropriate. If it's a shoot, no shoot scenario, maybe we are focusing on something more specific, like identifying ambiguous items in their hands that might not be a weapon. Or maybe we're focusing on body postures and behaviors that suggest weapons. Or maybe if it's a building search thing, we're talking about checking certain angles in a room. If it's a mass casualty drill, it might be related to the logistical challenge of moving patients to casualty collection points, right? Like how do we get everybody to me? Or specifically triage and accounting for patients and making sure we don't miss anybody and prioritizing patients or making transport decisions. Another building search scenario might be like, if we're talking about tactics, team tactics especially, is how do we deal with this certain type of intersection in a hallway, or these certain types of threat areas, whatever. Being thoughtful and detailed about those goals brings a lot of clarity to things. It drives your risk management decision. Like we already said in the beginning, your risk management decisions are going to be dependent on that. And it helps you contextualize your training, so you can kind of give them a story where they can hear about how this fits into their world in real life. And one of the most important and least understood concepts among a lot of trainers, and this is something that Mike Pannone talked about in our interview that we did with him, which was great. You should go check that one out. It's awesome. Is the difference between a drill and a scenario. So a drill, you're isolating one or a couple elements of a task, and there's a little bit less context, right? It's not really like, I'll give you an example of a building, like a SWAT team clearing a house. There's lots of reasons I might clear a house, right? It could be looking for a barricaded fugitive, or it could be serving a search warrant, or it could be part of a hostage rescue, or, there's several ways I can accomplish that. But sometimes I'm just going to be like, okay, we're just doing like, this is the like basic scenario, but you guys know, you just go clear the freaking house, right? Like knock on the door, breach the door, make entry, clear the house of any good guys and bad guys, right? Like just go. Whereas a scenario is more about creating a story. It's an immersive, contextualized exercise that is more of a simulation of real life decisions and proficiency, and whatever might be required of that situation. So now we're getting into, okay, well, this is a search warrant or a barricade or a hostage rescue, but I'm giving you an actual storyline that goes with it that might direct or dictate parts of your tactics. right? Like if you know going into it that it's a hostage rescue, it might change the way that you form your entry team, for example. Or if you know that it's a barricade resolution, you might decide to use robotics and tear gas or something like that. I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole here, but it gives you the idea where that it's more immersive like that, right? And on some level, you can blend the two a little bit, and kind of just give them a little bit of context so it's contextually appropriate to use this tactic or this skill and that we're going to use in this situation. But it's important sometimes to kind of scope what you're doing, right? To scale the scope to what you're doing and the decisions that you're going to incorporate. Because sometimes during the course of clearing that house, I'm going to isolate, the room entries themselves. Or maybe I want them to, in a trauma scenario, I want to just get repetition in doing assessments or patient moves or tourniquet applications. Or I want to make the people going through my training decide in context which patients go where and, who's more serious, who's more viable, in terms of like a mass casualty sort of thing, right? I could start to kind of narrow down some of those things if I give some context to it, but still make it sort of a drill. So it can be a little bit of both. You can blend it, but you need to decide going into it what those objectives are going to be and how you're going to scale it or scope it. Once you've figured those objectives out, some of those objectives are, scenario versus drill kind of things. Once you've figured some of that out, you can give some attention to the details. And so one of the things that I've brought up often, but probably not given enough attention to, is the difference between being results and process oriented. I mentioned this earlier a little bit when we talked about reverse engineering the safety, like the bad outcomes, as opposed to being concerned about the process to avoid the bad outcomes in the first place. Some people tend to focus on one or the other. They are focused on outcomes. They're all about winning or losing and nothing else matters. Or they're focused on, well, it's not whether you win or lose, but how you play the game. Well, I think anyone smart enough to listen to this podcast probably accepts that both are important. If you think about bad outcomes, losing the game or failing some mission, it's easy to get fixated on no excuses. And that's important because you want to win or succeed against all odds. But you should also understand what about your process led to a failure, right? If you have something that goes poorly, you need to now pick apart and understand why. And so I think that it's easy for people to say, well, if you focus on the process, you'll always win, right? But you get the results that you prepare for. And sometimes the enemy gets a vote and things don't go the way that we expected or thought they would. And so we have to kind of rinse and repeat and do it better next time. And so I think both are important, right? If you overemphasize the results, right? If you're only about the bad outcomes, especially as a leader or a trainer, then you might also encourage people to cheat or to take shortcuts or to hide things from you. So you should engineer your process, your training, and your practice, and your ability to learn from your mistakes and adapt, which is a cultural thing, right? Like building a strong culture among your group or your team or your students or whatever for success with that desired outcome in mind, but also you are focusing on the process to get there, right? The incremental steps to get there. And so this matters because you have to think about your training program and have a clear picture of what success looks like, right? Focus on on winning, and have that no excuses. We're going to get this no matter what, but then have a clear understanding also of the steps necessary to achieve that. So this is where things like selecting the right people for the right job comes in, and making sure that you are inspiring a growth mindset in your people where they are not afraid to make mistakes as long as they learn from them and accept responsibility from them. And then we motivate people towards the good outcomes at the expense of the hard work it's going to take to get there. And that means being able to sell your training. And if you have to sell it a few different directions, right? On one hand, you sell it to your students. right? You sell them the process. Hey, this is going to be hard work. This is going to be challenging. I'm going to take you outside of your comfort zone. You might get little nagging injuries here and there, but you're also going to make it cool, and it's going to be fun, or at least engaging and challenging and purposeful. And then you also have to make sure that your bosses are going to be cool with that. And those are very different things, because to make it good and worthwhile for your students, you're probably going to take some risk. You're probably going to need time, money, manpower, and other resources. And you need the bandwidth and the creative space to sit down and brainstorm and plan and design something awesome. And that's time consuming. And a lot of us, people like us, I would assume people listening to this podcast, are the sorts of people who probably do it on their own time, often not at work. So I'm not saying don't do that, but I'm saying that if you're a boss or a leader, you should recognize that your people are doing that. And when you can, give them that space, on duty, on the clock, or whatever. That being said, all that time that you're going to sit down and brainstorm and plan and design, you also have to make some extra time for doing it safely, right? So think about the intended results, come up with the training objectives or goals that get us closer to whatever that image of success is, whatever that is, and then get into the nitty gritty in terms of whatever day or evolution you are planning. You need to be able to take all those things, sketch them out, sell your training, because inevitably along the way, you're going to run into people who need to be sold on new ideas or risks that you're taking or costs that are involved or whatever. But you want to be able to basically stand up on your own 2 feet and own what your training is designed to accomplish and why it's effective and why it's important and why it's necessary and why the risks are worth it. And I think being able to show how much thought you've put into all of that goes a long way. So I hope that helps without trying to go into like specific training ideas for specific tasks. I know I gave examples kind of pertinent to my background, but it's hard to do a whole lot of the work for you. But what I hope to accomplish here was give you some inspiration for designing good training and also for keeping safety in mind, because it's easy to make a really cool training event and then you only get away with it once because someone got hurt and all the work that you did, it got shut down at the last minute by one of your bosses and you never get to do it again. So there's a lot that goes into that. So learn from my mistakes, go find new ones to make on your own. And in all seriousness, I think it's important to take your role as a trainer seriously to avoid people getting hurt or worse. If anyone out there is looking for specific ideas on training, and if there's some demand for it, maybe we can sit down and do an episode on that. But in a nutshell, if you're thinking about training, worry about the details, get into the details, really dig into that, because I think that's where the devil lies. And that is where you can really layer the context into your training that makes it realistic and will help you define what you're trying to accomplish and what the end state is and how to get there. Take separate time for safety. And anytime you're making a serious effort to make training good and realistic, you're going to accept some degree of risk. And that's not something you should half-ass. Do safety checks. Make sure you're not tricking yourself into the theater or the illusion of safety. Actually put checks and balances in place that make a difference. Remember that humans are usually the failure point in a lot of things. How often is pilot error, for example, a factor in plane crashes? That's a key thing to consider. So identify hazards, assess risk, make risk decisions, implement risk control measures, monitor, review. That process, although it sounds very, academic and boring and linear, it's going to help you not miss things. And when you accept risk, do it on purpose and do it with everyone in the loop so you can keep training and you can help keep your people ready for the mission, whatever that is. Some of the other places you can look for as far as help on training ideas, there's a ton of books that I've used, but some starting points. I think the book Talent is Overrated and The Talent Code are both very helpful for understanding how people gain and build expertise and talent. The book The Art of Learning, which if you want a primer on that, Joshua Waitzkin's the author of that. And he's been interviewed by Tim Ferriss on his podcast a couple of times, and you can kind of get an idea of what you'll hear in that book. But I think that one's worthwhile. The Inner Game of Tennis. Again, I think it's It's something that will help build your repertoire in terms of insights in training and coaching people and how people learn. So I think those are all must reads for people who teach as a part of their profession. We'll put links to those in the show notes. If you guys have questions or ideas for an idea that we should dive a little bit deeper on training design, hit us up and we'll put that on the list of ideas for the future. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert and only takes a few hours in the heat wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Berry and watermelon happen to be my favorite flavors. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or have your supply guy buy it for you. Also by Mantis. Mantis is the firearms training tool that tracks the movement in your gun so you can step up your performance with good data and feedback. Not only does it help you stay accountable and make training more enjoyable and cost-effective, it also works in dry fire so you can train at home. I swear by dry fire training. I use the Mantis every single time. If your shooting will have real-life consequences, use the Mantis to take your shooting to the next level. Get one and join our training group in the Mantis app. You can find them at mantisx.com. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon and give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you can email info@tacticaltangents.com. You can also go on Facebook, find the groups tab on our page, join the podcast discussion group, and we would love to interact with you there. And that's all I got. Good talk.